Hi folks, today we'll talk a little bit about racing strategy. You've probably heard me say before, and if not, you've heard other people say before that the way to run a race is with a negative split. Pretty much every single world record, I think, except for maybe two, have been set using a negative split from the 800 meter all the way up through the marathon. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about a negative split, they're thinking about this big time difference. For example, if you're running a half marathon and your goal was 2 hours, you might think, well, I'm going to have to run at a 2:05 pace the first half and a 1:55 pace the second half. It's actually a fairly slight difference. It's more like 2 hours and 30 seconds and then 1:59. It's a minor difference, but negative splits for virtually every race is the way to go. I should point out, though, that it is about the effort that you're expending, not necessarily the time. Not every course is going to allow for the time to be a negative split. I use an example of the Little Rock Marathon I did many years ago, but my memory of it, the first half is relatively flat. The second half is very, very hilly. From a time standpoint, you're unlikely to have a faster time the second half, but you want to manage that effort. So why do you want to manage the effort? Because, as you might know, running and racing is 80% mental and the other 20% is in your head. Because what happens, and if you've been in a race, you know this, you're fighting fatigue. Fatigue is what is going to get you in every single race. Now, the causes of the fatigue is different. You're going to fatigue for a different reason in a 5K than you will in a marathon, but you're always fighting fatigue, and what controls your fatigue? Well, your brain controls your fatigue. That gets back to the 80% mental and 20% is in your head. So let's go through a couple examples of that. So imagine, if you will, that a friend comes up to you and he's got a big bowl of Skittles and say, hey, would you like some Skittles? And you say, sure. You might grab a small handful of Skittles. Now imagine that same friend comes up and says, hey, would you like a Skittle? And you see that he doesn't have a lot of Skittles in there. You might say, no, thank you, or you would take one or two. You're going to use those Skittles very differently than when they had the big bowl. Well, your brain works the same way. At the start of the race, you've got this big bowl of Skittles. We're using this Skittles to represent this is what you have to give in a race, and your goal is to be almost out of Skittles by the very end. You can't actually be out. It's sort of like if you wanted to hold your breath until you passed out, you can't do it. Eventually, your brain's going to make you breathe. There's a point you can't override it. Even the elites can't use every single Skittle, but they get down to hardly any Skittles left, and that's where you want to go to. You want to use the bowl as wisely as possible. But again, at the very beginning, the Skittles seem like there's all kinds of them. So if you're going too fast, it's easy. It feels great. I can hold this pace, and you are just churning through Skittles like crazy. The problem is, way too early in your race, it gets down to this. And now the brain is looking. And your brain, whether you know it or not, is doing math and saying, okay, Mark has so far to go. I don't think he can make this. And the brain will start saying, you're fatigued, you've got to slow down, you can't do this anymore because you're going to run out of Skittles. It's kind of like in your car when the ding, 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 you're out of gas. Well, you know you're not out of gas. You've got 50 miles, 75 miles to go, but it starts giving that warning. The brain is doing the same thing. So that's why negative splits from a brain standpoint are so important. Don't get overjoyed that you've got all these Skittles to burn through, because if you get here too early in the race, then your brain is going to shut you down. But if you can conserve this till a little bit later in the race, it is easier for you to tell your brain, shut up, I've got this, there's actually plenty of Skittles left, and push through and have a great finish.